pattered gently against the glass, almost like an unspoken warning that was both steady and cold. J.D. Vance stepped into a dim, upscale restaurant, his coat damp from the weather, but he held himself with firm confidence. He chose a quiet corner, a place where soft conversations and the sound of clinking silverware created a warm atmosphere. As he settled into a plush leather seat, the waiter's attention flicked toward the front counter, where he made eye contact with the manager for a fleeting moment, a second long enough to convey a story without any words. The manager, wiping his hands on a pristine white cloth and adjusting his tie, approached with a demeanor that seemed more scripted than genuine. "Sir, I'm sorry," he began, his voice overly formal, "but we won't be able to serve you tonight." The manager's words sliced through the restaurant's warmth, sharp and final, creating a tense atmosphere. J.D. remained composed, resting his hands flat on the table, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost as if he had expected this question before. Was it because of the book he wrote, or the name he carried? The manager's throat tightened as he struggled to speak, only silence slipping from his lips, and finally breaking. In that moment, the restaurant wasn't quiet. It felt suffocating, filled with a silence that spoke volumes. This silence had roots that ran deeper than spoken words, and would resonate beyond those four walls. When J.D. stepped back onto the street that night, the rain still fell. But something inside him had shifted. The weight of the manager's words wasn't unfamiliar to him. The silence that hung in the air felt all too regular. As he walked through the puddles, the same moment replayed over and over in his mind. Not just that night, but countless times before. In this town, racism didn't raise its voice. It wore polished shirts, friendly smiles, and the neat precision of exclusion. Months prior, signs indicating his treatment had already been laid out for him. At a book signing in a small-town shop, the owner had locked the doors an hour early. Staff stood behind the glass, avoiding his gaze, as a sign read "Event Cancelled," offering no reason or conversation, just a cold barrier between him and an audience that never got a choice. There was also the fundraiser dinner, a lavish event filled with handshakes and money. When J.D.'s name was mentioned on the RSVP list, weeks before the restaurant incident, the internet had proven unkind. J.D.'s inbox overflowed with messages cloaked in mock concern, while his social media became a canvas for anonymous threats and insults. The distance between the verbal violence on the street and the online world was insignificant, with whispers of discrimination echoing in the backdrop of his life. It wasn't the first time he had heard others voice similar sentiments regarding this establishment. Different lives, same conclusions. The narration no longer resting in words, but stitched into the silence of onlookers who watched, shrugged, and moved on. That night, as J.D. crossed the street under flickering lamps, his thoughts fixated on a single question. How many more? How many had come before him? And how many would follow? On the other side of the restaurant's rain-speckled window stood a young woman, her phone half raised. Her fingers trembled. Yet she kept the camera steady, capturing the moment of denial that had just transpired. What she filmed was not a loud altercation, but a quiet refusal, a discrimination without expletives, nonetheless painfully sharp in its impact. Within hours, her footage would cycle online, reshared and captioned. J.D. Vance denied service, no explanation given. The quiet streets of the town would soon reverberate with fresh conversations. Whispers. For J.D., the fight had never been about just this one table or dinner. It was about the deeply entrenched pattern of exclusion masked by company policy. This was subtle racism, an insidious form that didn't resort to burning crosses or scrawling graffiti, but left deep marks nonetheless, doing its best to remain hidden in public, yet fester in the private spaces of people's lives. The video documentation of JD situation wouldn't expose the emotional store brewing inside him. Instead, it captured moments of quiet strength, his steady gaze, controlled breathing, and unbroken calm. Yet beneath that calm surface, an internal battle had already commenced. Each view, between the events at the table and a resurgence of the video on screens, something significant had begun to shift. Not with grand actions, but simply through the undeniable truth coming to light. What had started as one man's when JD's name was finally called, he approached the microphone slowly and deliberately, as if every step was imbued with significance rather than confrontation. He glanced across the room, exuding calm and steady presence, and then spoke with the same composure that had shocked everyone that night at the restaurant. Racism wears new suits now. Less spit, more smiles. The statement hung in the room, heavy and undeniably truthful. No one interrupted. No one dared to. The manager's gaze stayed fixed on the table, his hands stilled, the practiced words dissolving before he could articulate them. Apologies would serve no purpose. Not here. The room wasn't looking for excuses. They demanded truth, which hung palpably in the air. JD didn't clutter the space with lengthy speeches. Instead, he allowed the quiet to reveal what words often fail to do, letting it sink into the collective consciousness of those present. This evolved beyond a single incident. It illustrated every face in the room, some defensive, some shamed, some shifted. Without the scale of a protest, there was an undeniable movement happening. A community, long accustomed to ignoring its reflection, was finally forced to confront itself. The manager, once the embodiment of authority, now appeared diminished, his authority undercut by a camera and a matchless calmness that refused to let the story quietly fade. There was no need for rebuttal. The silence resonated louder than any defense could. The crowd remained seated, absorbing the gravity of what they had witnessed. Their somber realization took hold, not as evasive rage, but as a profound understanding that settled deep within them. The press conference concluded without drama. No shouting arose. JD retreated from the microphone the same way he had approached. Not hurried, but measured and composed. The manager remained seated long after the cameras turned away, as if standing would mean he had to face the reality of a world that had moved beyond him. As doors swung open and the townsfolk returned to their lives, the narrative didn't fade, but rather transformed. Footage of JD's calm words intertwined with the recorded moments from the restaurant, combined into an undeniable testament to injustice, contrasting heart-wrenching vulnerability against stoic resilience. The silence of those complicit in the wrongdoing spoke volumes, louder than any mitigation. Weeks turned into a quiet storm. The restaurant that once denied him service now stood vacant, blinds drawn tight, a feeble close for renovation sign taped to the door, an excuse that didn't convince anyone. Chairs were stacked against the windows, blocking the outside world, but the damage had already penetrated its foundations. Boycotts emptied those tables and left the kitchen cold and unwelcoming. Loyal patrons often found that their loyalty was tested against the weight of truth laid bare. Former staff members drifted away, some leaving town entirely, others seeking employment at neighboring diners. Each application met with polite nods but silent rejections. They bore tarnished reputations now hardened by betrayal. JD didn't revisit that street. Life continued to progress, even when the scars felt fresh. One afternoon, beneath a softer, kinder sky, he nestled into a small corner diner. In this space, the names mattered less than the faces, and kindness didn't come packaged with questions. The waitress, young and unassuming, effortlessly refilled his coffee, her smile radiant and uncalculated. As JD sat there, watching the steam rise from his mug, a quiet conviction settled within him. Not angry, not triumphant, simply steady. Dignity isn't handed out, it's claimed. Sometimes it requires the world to see one's wounds before they can grasp the depth of the scars they leave behind. The streets were different now, too. Conversations that had once felt awkward in public spilled forth without hesitation. Townspeople spoke candidly about fairness, history, and change with a newfound honesty that only springs forth after confronting long-ignored truths. Local schools revisited their curricula, and council meetings opened discussions once dismissed. Old laws that had lingered under bureaucratic dust began rising to the surface, demanding re-examination. What began was not a revolution complete with fireworks and headlines, but rather a gradual transformation, a kind that began quietly and embedded itself within the community. JD had witnessed enough to know that justice seldom arrives with bold declarations. It usually creeps in, almost unnoticed, until one day the landscape has shifted, and it dawns on everyone that things have changed. As for the manager, his life constricted. Friends became distant figures. Business colleagues evaporated, and the polite world he once comfortably inhabited now greeted him with sidelong glances and unspoken conversations. Invitations to social gatherings slowly dwindled. His once strong voice behind the desk faltered, and his presence became invisible in public spaces. There were no viral sensations for this part of the tale, just subtle, everyday moments that hinted at a slow and painful unraveling. Doors that weren't held open, calls that went unanswered, tables that never materialized. The kind of loneliness that even the largest crowd couldn't mitigate. So the town continued on, each day folding into the next, as the world outside learned to recognize the name of a place that once masked injustice in silence, but was ultimately exposed. JD no longer needed to confront microphones. His narrative had already permeated the community. On one of those languid afternoons, as dusk settled and the sun kissed the horizon, JD rose from his booth, left a quiet tip on the table, and walked toward the door with ease, his head held high, the weight of the past no longer a burden upon his shoulders. The chime of the bell above the door rang softly as it closed behind him, and somewhere in the background, beyond the chatter of the diner and the dimming day, the world continued to shift. Yet, the echo of his story lingered, reminding everyone that the most potent victories don't always erupt through noise, but through the quiet resilience of those who refuse to yield.